Welcome to Dark Facade, a channel dedicated to looking past the veneer of humanity and finding its true face. I will be your tour guide down this winding path of tales, ranging from the supernatural, science fiction, and twisted love. All the stories you're about to hear are assorted bits of literature that will range from the bizarre to the unexpected. So sit back, lower the lights, and allow yourself to be taken away from everyday reality to its shadowy reflection. If you enjoy our unusual content, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button to receive more. Thank you. The Book of Dark Names by Katie Rogers, read by Katie Rogers, Chapter 15. The pathway to the all-knowing proved to be nothing more than a dark tunnel with a light at the end. Christopher pondered whether or not this might be the very passageway that people referred to that had near-death experiences. God, he hoped not. When they reached the other side, their emotions were running amok between fear and anger. The unknown was literally over the threshold, and Daniel's fate was uncertain. Laura was picking up on his vibrations, which told her he was there and alive. She quickened her pace, leaving the others behind. "Laura," Sean called. "Wait, we don't know what's out there." "Daniel's out there, and he's not alone," she informed him. "So you're picking up on another presence? Can you tell us if it's hostile or not?" Richard asked. "All I can tell you is, it's big," she replied as she reached the edge of the threshold. Her courage waned, forcing her to wait for the others to catch up. They stood a moment, gazing at the light beyond, not knowing what to expect, but knowing they had to go. Laura took a deep breath, then stepped into the light. The others followed suit, leaving the realm they knew for the one they didn't. When they came out on the other side, they were not prepared for what they saw. All about them were rocky plateaus that were floating like icebergs in an ocean of stars. The source of light was from a great swirling vortex above their heads. It resembled water going down a drain, framed in white and pink light, which faded into black. Daniel was lying motionless directly underneath it a few feet away. Laura and Sean rushed over to have a look at him. He was unconscious, but his eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of madness. Their worst fears were confirmed. It had all unfolded just as they were afraid it would. They had lost Daniel now. It felt like they were trapped in the Agatha Christie novel 10 Little Indians, with Kadath picking them off one by one. Laura's eyes trailed up to the swirling mass above them, and she shook her head. "What is it?" Christopher asked. "The massive vibrations I was telling you about? That's the source," she replied with venom. "You mean that this is Hectonus, the all-knowing," she said gruffly, answering Richard's question before he had finished asking it. The two scientists became frightened at first, but only at first. They soon realized that unlike its compatriots, Hectonus was relatively non-reactive to their presence. In fact, it didn't seem to notice them at all. True, it had taken Daniel's mind, but only because he had tried to enter into its consciousness. Christopher moved in a little closer as curiosity overtook him. As he stood directly underneath it, nothing happened. Richard, who was also intrigued by the passiveness of such a powerful being, stood beside him in silent observation. Sean noticed that there was something wedged under Daniel's back. He pulled it free and saw it was the other grimoire. Daniel had disappeared with it in the bedroom an hour before they noticed he was missing. He wasn't sure if they could find a way to undo what had happened to his friend, but he had to try. As he opened the book to flip through the pages, it was snatched from his hands by an unseen force. When he looked up, he was met with the horrendous sight of Anna on her knees at Kadath's feet. He was holding the book in one hand and her by her hair in the other like some sadistic puppeteer. Her clothing had been replaced with a barely there Egyptian-looking gown that was slit up both sides and low enough that her breasts nearly spilled out. Akaike glared at the dark creature with rancor. The only positive outcome to Daniel's predicament was he did not have to witness his wife's humiliation. Kadath emerged completely from his shadowy harbor, taking on a more human appearance. He was dressed equally vulgar as Anna, wearing a skirt made from nearly transparent linen. He wore some sort of amulet around his neck, which hung down his bare chest. He smiled viciously at the small assembly as his black eyes gleamed in fiendish joy. "So what do you think of my lovely new sister?" he asked his remaining band of enemies, while forcing her head back to run his tongue over her face. Anna cried out in pain and disgust, provoking a perverted laugh out of him. "Stop it, you asshole!" Laura snarled. "Ah, Miss Blaine," he said, fixing his black stare on her. "The catalyst." "What?" she spat. "Anna has you to thank for all this. You brought her to me, did you not?" "I brought her to help," Laura protested. "And you did." "Thank you," he grinned maliciously, knowing his remark had pierced through her guilty heart. "What do you hope to achieve by coming here?" Christopher asked, trying to divert his attention away from Laura. "Achieve? Why, nothing, Dr. Harris. I don't need to achieve anything anymore. In fact, I'm almost finished," the Dark One declared. "Finished? With what?" Akaike asked. "With you all," Kadath said, then yanked Anna's hair so tight it caused tears to fall from her eyes. "Stop it, you prick! Stop hurting her!" Laura yelled. "I promise, Ms. Blaine, you won't have to witness this much longer. I'm going to give you all something more pressing to worry about." Suddenly, the group felt a strange pull from behind. When they turned to see what was happening, they saw something unbelievable. Large chunks of the starry horizon opened into dark passageways. Before any of them had time to react, they were knocked off their feet and were pulled towards them. As they struggled in the unbeatable force that gripped them, Christopher watched as Laura and Richard disappeared into one passageway, while Sean was sucked into another. Before he was pulled into his own black hole, he caught a glimpse of Anna. Though her face was filled with anxiety, there was something else lurking in her eyes. Christopher could not quite pinpoint it, and his time was cut short as the passageway swallowed him up. He didn't remember losing consciousness, but Christopher found himself waking up on the cold ground. He got up to have a look around at his surroundings. Everywhere was darkness. There were no shapes, no sounds, nothing, except Christopher and the echo of his own footsteps. He called out only a few moments more before finally giving up. Kadath had clearly left him alone. Wherever the others were, he had no idea. The only thing he was certain about was each of them had been banished to different dimensions that were beyond human capability to penetrate. Every scientific theory that he had read about alternate dimensions began to fill his head as he wandered through the misty darkness. Before Evelyn had passed, she had tried to help him reconcile all that he was experiencing with the foundation of science. A slight smile curved at his lips as her image popped into his mind. He could almost hear her laughing softly as he leaned on science to get him through. Step 1. Form a hypothesis. Are all dimensions outside of his own like this one? Based on what Anna had shared with them before Kadath took her, his guess was no. His next deduction was whether or not Kadath had purposely chosen each of their banishments carefully, or were his actions random. The emptiness of his current location would be bleak for anyone, but it was particularly loathsome for Christopher. A mind such as his craved stimulation. He was trapped in a void. There was only so much he could do to keep his mind occupied before the solitary shadows closed in. If Kadaf had chosen a hell for each of them, this would surely become his. As the echo of his own footsteps became louder, he concluded that their immortal adversary had, in fact, chosen their prisons carefully. His need to escape heightened at this sudden realization. However bad his situation was, if his hypothesis rang true, there was no telling what he did to the others. Their banishments might also serve as a source of food for the ancient being. Negative energy made him stronger. These dimensions, by their design and nature, were chosen to bring about misery. He had to get out. He had to find a way. If there was an entrance to these realms, then there had to be an exit. The how and where he would discover this was a complete mystery. He was literally and figuratively stumbling through the dark. His mind wandered back to Evelyn again. She had called him a pioneer. No, she actually had suggested he think of himself as one. This was an unexplored part of science. He could take this concept from fiction to fact, but he had to keep his wits about him to do so. Concentrate, Harris, he thought. How the hell are you going to get out of here? The distinct sound of footsteps made him pause all activity. Had he gone mad, or did he in fact hear something or someone walking? He thought about calling out, but decided against it. There was no proof that whatever or whoever was in here with him was benign. His mind began to race with 1,000 different scenarios. What if it was one of the others who had managed to get through? No, it couldn't be. They would call out, wouldn't they? Perhaps it was another person who had been put here long ago, as he had. What sort of mental state would they be in? Fear and uncertainty were beginning to set in. "Stop it, you're acting like a scared rabbit," he inwardly chastised himself while trying to regain control. Once his logical mind returned, he decided to call out to whoever was coming towards him. "Hello, can you hear me? My name is Christopher Harris." The footsteps stopped for a moment, then resumed, this time with a quickened pace. He was not sure whether this was a good or bad thing. What he was certain of was that the stranger approaching him was not one of his compatriots. Though every fiber of his being was compelling him to run, he fought it. He rarely let fear rule him in his life, and he wasn't going to let it now. Whatever was coming towards him was his best shot at getting any answers. He rooted himself to his spot, squinting through the murky haze while listening to the footsteps get closer. At last a shape did emerge, one that was darker than the blackness that surrounded him. The silence of it spoke volumes. Christopher felt himself backing away. Then he began to run. All the rational thought had fled with the appearance of the dark entity. He could hear it chasing him, and even worse, it was gaining. There was nowhere to go and nowhere to hide. There was only the eternal night, fog, and the two of them. He couldn't run forever. His legs were beginning to tire, and his lungs were starting to burn. He didn't care. He would run until he collapsed. He ran for what seemed to be eternity, until at last he did fall to the ground. He lay there immobile, gasping for breath. His pursuer came to an abrupt halt a few feet behind him. In that moment he knew he had been captured. He decided, however, that he was going to face this thing head on. Whatever it was about to do to him, it was going to do with him watching. He turned to look at it. To his shock, the being was just standing over him, motionless. He stared at it in confused curiosity. What was it waiting for? Perhaps he wasn't frightened enough to stimulate its palate. If this thing was an agent of Kadaf's, then he would take some joy in denying it a truly satisfying meal. "This is all you'll be getting out of me," so it's now or never, he spat. The shadow still did nothing. Whether out of curiosity or boldness, Christopher managed to struggle to his feet and come face to face with his aggressor. They stood only for a moment, shadow and man, each staring into the void of the other. He wasn't sure why, but he believed that the darkness wasn't there to harm him. What it seemed to be doing was waiting for something. But what? Christopher decided to make yet another fearless move and touch it. The pounding of his heart was so loud in the deafening silence that he knew the shadow could hear it. As he reached up to touch it, the being leaned forward, connecting them instantly. His touch caused a rippling effect, like that of a stone tossed upon the surface of a lake. Light resonated from the growing waves until they became so bright he had to close his eyes to shield them. The first sensation he felt was slender, calm fingers sliding down his chin, then resting on his cheek. "Christopher, you can open your eyes now." Evelyn's voice filled his ears like a favorite old song he hadn't heard in a long while. His eyes popped open to bear witness to what his ears had declared. She smiled in understanding at his gleeful amazement. Though his mind could not quite grasp the concept, his heart was none the less exhilarated. He didn't know if he'd gone crazy, but if he indeed had, he welcomed this sweet madness with open arms. The empty black void that had been his prison from before had melted away into a beautiful forest, complete with a cabin on the lake. He recognized this place. This was her family's vacation spot. Rachel had purchased the land and, along with the help of her children, had restored the old cabin to as good as new. He remembered spending a week there one summer. Evelyn once told him that it was her favorite place in the whole world. When he finally focused on her, he became captivated by how beautiful she was. Her chestnut locks hung loose and free around her shoulders. Her blue eyes sparkled like the water before them. She was dressed in a long navy calico print sundress with simple white sandals. She was in the image of her youth, and Christopher couldn't help but kiss her. Not just because she was so lovely, but because she reminded him of happier days. She kissed him back before finally pulling away, then tugged gently at his fingers. He followed as she led him away from the water's edge. They walked up a rocky pathway until they reached the front porch of the cabin. There was a small table set up with tea and cookies. She sat him down beside her, still holding his hand. Christopher stared at his surroundings in awe, wondering once again if he'd gone insane. Evelyn's chuckle directed his attention back to her. "You're not crazy, Chris," she assured him. "You're just visiting my heaven." "Your heaven?" he stammered. "That's right. Most people have one, and most people get one, too," she replied. The barking of a dog disrupted their conversation. A big yellow lab came bounding up the slope, dripping wet, with a ball in its mouth. Christopher instantly recognized Evelyn's beloved childhood pet. She laughed as the golden beast shook the excess water from its fur after dropping a soggy ball in her lap. "Sarah, where are your manners?" Evelyn scolded softly. The animal could not have cared less whom she might have offended with her buoyant display. She instead pushed at the ball in her mistress's lap with a determination that would not be denied. Evelyn held the ball up playfully, causing the dog to freeze as if hypnotized by the green sphere. "Is this what you want?" she whispered. The dog grunted. "Very well, but this is the last time for a bit. I need to speak with Christopher. All right?" The canine barked in agreement, so Evelyn threw it back down the slope. Now that the deal was struck, Sarah happily chased the object of her desire back down the hill. Christopher stared at his lost love, with a new perspective. She had not been gone long, but she seemed so much lovelier than he remembered. Perhaps it was because the perpetual sadness in her eyes was gone. There was only joy in her gaze now, even as he looked at her in complete perplexity. Everything you see and are experiencing here is real, Dr. Harris. There is no trickery of the mind or illusions, she told him while pouring him a steaming cup of tea. After adding a spoonful of sugar and a dash of milk, she handed it to him. He could feel his hands shaking a bit, but he managed to steady them before taking the cup. Christopher did not know what to expect before taking a sip, but he relished the hot, sweet liquid as it ran down his throat. Evelyn waited in silence until she was certain his nerves had settled. "How's your tea? You still prefer it with 1 scoop of sugar and a little milk, right?" she asked. "Evelyn, we are a little beyond these pleasantries, wouldn't you say?" he rebuffed bluntly. "Yes, I suppose we are," she nodded. "Forgive me, but the last time we spoke, you were dying in my arms and begging me to hold on. Hold you tight so the darkness could not get you. Do you remember?" "Yes, I remember it all. The paralyzing fear of my own mortality, and the tremendous strength of your arms as you held me tighter and tighter. It was the horrible desperation of your eyes that I took with me into those black depths. They pulled me from one world into another. I awoke there in the same place of eternal night and fog, feeling trapped and lonely just like you." "So what happened?" he shrugged. "I called out, just as you had. But I didn't—" He paused at her knowing stare. He had called out, and somehow she had heard him. "I was greeted by the person who knew me and loved me just as I was." "Rachel," he murmured. "Yes," Evelyn nodded. "But how is she after the two of you spoke in the prayer garden that day?" she told him. He stared at her, completely dumbfounded. "The knowledge of death, time, and space are a wonder, my love," she said, cupping his face. He simply nodded before holding her hand and asking what Rachel had said. "She told me that I was in a blank state. The only limit to its possibility was me. You see, it was up to me to mold it and shape it into what I wanted," she explained. "So this is heaven by design?" Christopher asked. "It's as good an explanation as any," Evelyn replied. "Are you alone here? What about Rachel?" "All those we know and love can come to visit," she told him. "Am I dead?" he asked. "No, of course not," she grinned. "Then how and why am I here?" he asked, confused. "The how is because of Anna, the why is because of me," she answered. He paused as his mind raced through 1,000 more questions. "Believe me, Chris, I understand. I get how strange this all is for you. Once you let go of life as you know it over there, then the way things are over here will make more sense. Unfortunately, I don't have time to explain it all. You need help, and I can give it," she told him. "Evelyn, I don't understand how I can be here with you and be alive. I don't get why Kadaf would put me in a place where you could reach me. None of this makes sense," he exclaimed as his desperation was beginning to take over. She remembered this was how he got when circumstances defied logic and reason. They were his stronghold, the rocks he clung to as he navigated through life. Evelyn slid her arm around his broad shoulders, then drew his head down to rest on her slender ones. "Be still, Christopher, and just listen, okay?" She felt him nod. "Anna, not Kadaf, put you in this realm. She tricked him, and by doing so, it made possible for me to reach you. You see, he did believe that the stillness would drive you mad. What he didn't count on was someone hearing you when you called. Normally the dead cannot hear the living, but in the dreamlands we can speak, she explained. Is that where I am, the dreamlands? He murmured inquisitively. It was where you were, and it is how I reached you and brought you here. Just know this, some part of me will always hear you, Christopher. Some part of me will always find its way to you, she whispered. He shifted as she spoke. Evelyn's tenderness now touched him deeply. He wasn't comfortable with expressing such emotions. It was something he could do with very few people. His affection for Evelyn was undeniable. Her unquestionable openness had drawn him in over the years and made her one of those people. Her declaration of devotion had warmed him now. Strangely enough, his mind drifted for a moment to a verse in the Bible that had been her favorite. What was it again? Rachel used to recite it to her before big events in her life. I will lift my eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help, he murmured. Evelyn smiled as she tightened her arm around him. He still knew her and understood her as no one living or dead would. She tilted his head back to bask in his gaze one last time. There was love for him there in her crystal blue eyes, true and undeniable. She kissed him with the lightest of touches, but it penetrated to his very core. There is a gate at the end of my drive, Chris. You must go through it. It will lead you to a massive corridor that will take you to different realms. The doors will not be visible to the living, so you'll have to take Sarah with you. She can show you which doors to choose and where they are. Sarah, your dog? His skepticism was beginning to show. Think of her as your guide dog, she smiled mischievously. He almost asked her if she was serious, but given the situation, it seemed rather stupid. As if on cue, Sarah appeared at the foot of the steps. Her coat was now dry, and her whimsical stare had now changed to a more intent demeanor. Evelyn's arms slid away, forcing Christopher to his feet. He knew without asking she wasn't going to walk with him. He had to go alone. As he began his descent on the steps, he paused and turned back. There was something he wanted to say to her, but never got the chance. The day you died was the darkest one of my life. I didn't really know pain until your eyes closed forever, and you uttered those horrible words. There is nothing. She shook her head in sympathy as she listened to what he had to say. He took another moment to regain himself, then finished his thought. You were the most gracious soul I had ever met in my life, Evelyn Gray. You are the love of my life, and I will miss you. I will miss you until the day I die. He let that last part hang between them as an unspoken assurance that they would meet again. She quietly blew him a kiss before he turned to walk away.